Hey friends, if you're brand new to programming, it can all seem a bit overwhelming at first. Not only are there so many different languages and frameworks to pick from, but there's a lot of conflicting advice on what you need to learn. So many internet gurus are saying you need to master data structures and algorithms, solid, O notation, and binary trees. All of that is important, but if you haven't mastered the basic skills, then you're going to struggle to make any of that stick. I'm a firm believer in working from first principles and understanding from the ground up how everything works. For example, there's no point learning React until you're fluent in JavaScript. There's no point doing machine learning until you understand how an array works. Everything you learn is just built up on top of previous knowledge. It's just how your brain works. So if you're brand new to programming, these are the 6 things you need to master before moving on to something new. Number 1 is variables. Now, variables are used in programming to store values that you're going to be using. Say, for example, you're writing a program to calculate someone's age from their date of birth. The date of birth in this case is going to be stored as a variable, so you can make changes to it without needing to change the code itself. Variables are also used to make the code clearer to the reader. In this example, I have today's date as a variable to make it clear what this line of code is doing. Number 2 is data types. All programming languages have a set number of data types that are supported. These are the types of values that are stored in a variable. Depending on the programming language you are using, a variable's data type might be fixed the moment you create it or declare it, to use the correct terminology, or in some languages it can be changed. Python and JavaScript both let you change the data type of a variable throughout your application. For example, a variable could start off as an integer and later change to a string. Once you get to write bigger and more complicated applications, this can become a pain, as it's often the cause of hard to find bugs in your code. This is why commercial applications tend to be written in strongly typed languages such as C# or Java. Number 3 is if statements. Unless your application is very basic, it's going to need to do different things depending on what the inputs are. This is where if statements come in. They allow you to add logic to your application depending on the value of your variable. Let's carry on with our age example from earlier. Say you want to work out if someone's old enough to watch an 18 rated film. Here you would use an if statement and check the value of the age variable to see whether they're old enough. If they are, we print a message to say enjoy the film. If not, we print a sorry message. The condition that you put in an if statement needs to return either true or false. Most programming languages have the following logical conditions you can use in your code: equals, not equals, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. You can also put multiple conditions together with the logical operators and or. In Python, you would just use the words and or, but in other languages such as JavaScript, then you'd often use a double ampersand for and a double pipe for or. If you're using a language which requires double ampersands or double pipes, then make sure you actually include 2 of them. If you only include one of them, you end up doing bitwise operations, which I'll cover in another video. In some languages, such as Python, true and false are also represented as 1 and 0. If you have a look at our age calculation, the part in brackets uses the less than operator. What this part of the code is doing is working out if today's month and day is less than the month and day of your date of birth. If it is, the expression is true or equal to 1, so it subtracts 1 from your age as if you haven't had your birthday yet. Otherwise, it is false, which is equal to 0 and doesn't subtract anything. Number 4 is functions and procedures. One of the key principles of software development is called the DRY principle, which stands for don't repeat yourself. As your program gets bigger, there are going to be pieces of code that you're going to want to reuse. There might be multiple places you want to calculate someone's age, for example, and you don't want the same piece of code scattered all over your code base. This is where functions and procedures come in. There isn't much difference between functions and procedures. Generally, a function takes an input and calculates an output. A procedure, on the other hand, will perform a task but won't necessarily give you an output. The print statement in Python is an example of a procedure, as it prints text to the screen but doesn't actually give you an output in the code. To create a function, you need to define it and give it a name. In our case, let's call it calculate age. It's important to give your functions and variables good names so they are easy to understand when you're reading your code. Next, we're going to put in the code we had earlier to calculate the age into our new function and then return the age variable at the end. It's important to note that the variables you're using inside a function aren't the same as the ones you're using outside a function. So any changes you make to variables inside the function aren't going to make changes to the ones outside. This is known as pass by value. In other languages, such as C#, it's possible to do pass by reference. This actually changes the variable that you pass in. Lastly, we need to call the new function to calculate the age inside our code. We can even turn our print statements into a procedure to make our code a little tidier. I've used the string function here to turn our integer into a string that we can print. Number 5, arrays. Arrays are one of the most important data structures in programming. We covered variables earlier, which are used to store one value. Arrays are used to store multiple values. In our age program, instead of having one date of birth, we could have multiple dates of births in an array. In most languages, you can add and remove items from your program during the running of your application. In Python, for example, this is done with the append pop and remove methods. Once you have an array of values, you need a way to run your code against each item in the array, which brings us nicely onto loops. There are two main types of loops you need to know about: while loops and for loops. While loops are used to loop through your code until a condition is no longer true. Maybe you're adding to a variable or waiting for the user to get the correct answer. This is something you would use a while loop for. For loops, on the other hand, are specifically used for looping through an array. We can therefore use a loop in our code to loop through our dates of birth array and calculate the age for each of them. With these 6 things, you should have enough information to start your first program. If you're struggling to work out which programming language to start with, you might like to check out this video on which programming language is best for beginners. Thank you for watching. See you next time.